mographplus.com. If you are interested in learning Arnold for 3ds Max fundamentally, please make sure to check out our comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max course, which is a massive 8-hour long course in which we explore all the aspects of Arnold for 3ds Max thoroughly. Hey folks, welcome back to mographplus.com. It's Kamel Khezri here with you. In this tutorial, we'll learn how to create a complex painted wood shader in Arnold for 3ds Max. Before watching this video tutorial, it's imperative that you take a look at our comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max course, in which we go through and take a look at every aspect of Arnold inside of 3ds Max, different nodes, different shaders, lighting, and all of that. Make sure to check that out at our website mographplus.com. The link is down below in the description. Also, make sure to check out our 2 free video tutorials on our YouTube channel, tutorial number 67 and 86, in which we create simpler shaders in Arnold for 3ds Max and go through fundamentals of shader creation in Arnold for 3ds Max. Because this tutorial is going to have a quicker pace, we're going to go through the shader quite faster. In fact, we're not going to be constructing the shader from scratch, we're going to be deconstructing. I'm just going to show you how I made the shader and show you different nodes that I used, and then you can obviously download the project files down below in the description and take a look and take a more in-depth look at the shader and the nodes that we have used here. Now, this is the basically final render we're gonna get from this lesson, this one, and we're gonna be also creating a green shader as well instead of this black shader. And if you just close this, I think I have another reference image. Let me just, here we go. And basically we're going to be trying to create something like this. As you can see, we have this green paint and we have some underlaying wood that showing up on these worn out edges. So basically we need to create 2 different materials, the green paint and the wood, and then we need to create a mix map or something like a mask so the underlaying wood would only show up on these worn out edges. If you take a look at the green paint itself, obviously now we're dealing with plastic and paint, and the Fresnel reflectivity or the IR value would be something about 1.5 to 2. For wood, normally this value is maybe around 2.5, 3, 3.5, but because we're dealing with plastic and paint, the Fresnel reflectivity would be lower, and the basically the Fresnel effect would be stronger. And as you can see, the color, the diffuse color or the base color of this green paint isn't one solid color. We have different shades of green, as you can see, darker ones and brighter ones. And also, if you take a look at this part where the light hits the surface directly, you can see we have a fairly strong bump mapping as well, so we need to recreate that as well. The surface is fairly reflective, and it's probably also a bit rough, something like 0.2 for the specular roughness would most likely suffice. And the wood, underlaying wood itself, we don't need to be worried that much about the shader because it's not showing up too much, so we're going to be making a very simple shader, and the harder section would be to create a map to control where this wood will basically show up on the edges, and as you can see throughout the surface where the paint doesn't have good enough structural integrity, we get these kind of spots where the underlaying wood will show up. All right, so we need to make sure we take that as well into consideration. So let's get back to 3ds Max and start working. Now in this scene, as you can see, if I just press P and go to the perspective view, you can see we have this very simple sideboard model. We have this backdrop, we have a few lights in the scene. You can see a sky dome light and a bunch of area lights. You can check the lighting out on your own, but if I press C, here's the camera that we're going to be rendering. Now if I press M and go to the material editor, just close this preview window here, this is basically the shader network that we're going to be creating that would result in that final render that we saw together. Obviously this is the green version, but I'm going to show you the black version as well. As you can see, we have basically, this is our green paint material, all of these nodes here. Okay, these are the green paint materials nodes, and we have this wood shader. As you can see, it's very simple compared to what we have created for our green paint. And then we have these nodes, which basically they control the mix map, which controls where this wood will show up. Now, before taking a further look into this shader, I want to introduce to you two new shaders that they just made it available inside of Arnold for 3ds Max. And if you have followed my Arnold tutorials in Cinema 4D, I've kind of turned to use them a lot, and it's very good that we now have access to those two nodes inside of 3ds Max. And those two nodes are layer shader, okay, and layer RGBA. Basically, layer shader allows you to stack up materials, and layer RGBA allows you to stack up textures and color inputs. So in this case, to basically stack up these two different materials, we have used a layer shader here. And to stack up different textures, for example, here we have this 4 texture combined into this layer RGBA shader. You can see we're using a layer RGBA. So basically this allows you to composite and have a Photoshop-like environment inside of Arnold for 3ds Max, which is very good. So if I just take a quick look at here, we have this layer shader. Let's just quickly take a look at that. If I create a standard surface, okay, so we can say this is our first material, this white standard surface shader. So we connect it to input 1. Let's hold on shift and create a second standard surface shader, and let's change the base color to maybe this purplish color, okay? And let's say this is our second input, right? Now obviously the second input will cover the first input completely. If I get back to the layer shader, you can see our first input, we have this material. For the second input, we have this material. If I zero it out, only the first standard surface shader will show up. If I put it to obviously 0.5, we're gonna get a mix of the two, and if I set it to 1, we are gonna get only the second standard surface shader. But I can obviously use, let's say, a black and white map. Let's say this BW8, and I can use this as my mix 2. So if I set this to mix 2, now the second standard surface shader will only show up where the mix 2 map is white, and in the black parts the first standard surface shader will show up. As you can see, you can mix and match up to 8 shaders like this. So that's the layer shader, and we obviously have the layer RGBA for just working with the texture. So if I just select this, let's just delete this. If I select this layer RGBA and create a map to material to see the outcoming result, and if I connect this here, we can say for the first input, we just wanna, let's say, use a basic color, no texture, nothing. And for the second input, let's say we wanna use this black and white map. So I connect this to input 2. And now if we set these to something like, we can use now to overwrite, it's completely overwrites the first layer, but we can use different blending modes, like for example, let's say max, and now only the brighter parts will show up on the first texture. And now we can obviously use the resulting texture to control something like the base color of a standard surface shader, right? There we go. That's simple. So that's the layer RGBA shader. Now let's get back to our own network. And as you can see, I have used a bunch of layer RGBA and layer shaders in this network. Let me just get back here and make some space. This is the green paint shader that we have. And if you take a look at the shader itself and just the standard surface shader without any inputting map, you can see the base color is set to 1. We are using this green color for now as our base color. The specular weight is set to 0.2 and the specular roughness is set to 0.2. The IR or Fresnel reflectivity is set to 2, and this is what we get. Now, as I previously mentioned, the way I kind of tend to create and develop shaders is that I first kind of try to make sure the specular weight, specular roughness, and the other important values have a nice and correct range for what I have in mind. Now that I have these particular values, I can start adding variations to them using black and white textures, right? And that's what we're going to be doing exactly. So this is the map with all the textures that we have. So let's take a look at what we get. Okay. Now before doing that, let me just quickly show you what we have here. So if I just go to the sideboard model, I select the wood part here, and let me just assign this first part of our shader and run the active shade. So that's our main material. As you can see, we have this variation in our base color, some variation in the specular weight and specular roughness, and obviously some bump mapping. And then we have this wood shader here, right? And now what we need to do is to make sure that this wood shader will only show up in the specific parts that we want. And for that reason, we have created this map here. So let me just quickly show you this. So as you can see, the first part of our shader, this green, has been connected to the input 1 of the layer shader. The second part, which is this wood shader, has been connected of the input 2. And then we have this map that controls the mix 2 input of the layer 2. So if you come down here, just create that. This is the map. So if I create a map to material just to see the resulting texture here, and actually assign this to the and run the active shade. Now, as you can see, using this map, the wood shader will only show up in the white sections, and in the black section, the green paint would basically show up. And now this texture, if I just close this, as you can see, has been connected here to the mix 2 input of our layer shader. Perfect. Now, let me take a look at the different maps that we have here. So first of all, this is the base color map that we have assigned. I'm probably gonna need to create and have a map to material all the time. We can probably just make it a bit bigger and assign this layer shader and connect it to the texture map input. So basically, this is the map that we have, and if I run the active shade, this is our base color map, and this map basically is a result of bunch of textures being combined together, which they finally result in this map. Now if I close this and come back to the layer shader itself, just so we have a bit more space, we can definitely make this tad smaller. Now the layer shader that we're using to control the base color, now you can actually ignore this too. For now, we can just actually go ahead and connect this directly to our base color input. Okay, so you don't have to worry about this too. We're just basically converting our green paint wood to a black paint using this tool. I'm going to show you what they're doing here. Now, as you can see, this layer shader has been connected directly to the base color input of our standard surface shader, our painted wood. Now, as you can see, we have a bunch of layers here. I'm going to be very quick. We have this green input with the mix set to 1. And for the second layer, we have this brighter shade of green. And as you can see, we have a mix 2 map, which is basically this texture here. If I take a look at the map, this one. And this has been connected to our, if I take a look at this, to our mix 2 map. So if I just come here and turn off my layer 3, 4, and 5, you can see what this second layer is doing. And as you can see, the operation is set to over, and as you can see, we're going to get this brighter shade of green on top of our base green here. And for the third layer, as you can see, we just have a black and white map being connected to the third input, and then the operation is set to multiply, and the mix value is set to 0.2. If I set it to 1, as you can see, we get a much darker result, but just 0.2 would be enough just to add a bit more variation to our shader. And this is the map that we have used here for this one. Okay. And for the fourth layer, again, we are using another black and white texture. You can check that out with the operation set to matte, or it can be set to override, which is basically the normal blending mode if you are not familiar with these new names. And the mix for value is set to 0.05, so it just barely adds anything to the overall effect. And for the fifth layer, we just add a brighter shade of green again. As you can see, it adds all of this detail, and we're using this map here as the mix map for this layer, right? Mix 5 basically. Perfect. So that's our base color map, and as you can see, then we have our specular weights map, which is this map here. And basically, it's a fairly simple map. We are taking this BW38 map, and what we are doing with this range map is to basically make sure the values stay true to the particular specular weight that we had in mind. If you remember, the specular weight that we had in mind for this particular shader was about 0.2. But the values of this texture that we want to use it to control our specular weight, if I directly connect it to this map to material, you can see are very, very bright. And we want to make sure the range of these values are about 0.2. So we're using this range map, which you can find on Arnold math range. And we're just, and what we're doing is make sure the zero input mean to the input max of 1 are going to output 0.1 to 0.3. And this is going to basically get us a much darker map, because the specular weight that we had in mind was about 0.2 or 20% of the brightness. And this is basically the first layer of the map. Okay, if I connect this layer shader again. And for the second layer, we are using this other texture from here, which is this BW 5 here. Okay, and what we have done, we basically make sure we have basically set the operation to max just to add these brighter spots. So if I set the mix to value to 1, you can see what this texture is adding. The max is basically like the lighten blending mode if you're coming from Photoshop or previous versions of Arnold. So we use the fairly low value of about 0.19 just to add fairly brighter spots and make sure we don't have very bright spots, so those sections will be very reflective on our map. So this way now we're gonna have a normal specular weight map with the values around 0.2, so we get that particular specular reflections that we want. Now, if you take a look at this map, obviously we have this black and white map, and these black sections are going to cause in less specular reflections, and these brighter parts are going to cause in more specular reflections. Obviously, when a section on our surface is less reflective, we want it to be also more rough and have a higher specular roughness value. And that's why our specular roughness map, which is this particular layer RGBA here, is kind of the inverted version of our specular weights map with a bit more extra details. Now, if I take a look at the specular roughness map that we have, which is this texture here, and connect it to the texture map input of our map to material node, you can see we kind of have the inverted version of the specular weight. If I just connect this again, take a look at this bright spot, for example, here or here. Let's take a look at this one. If I connect this here, you can see this is a dark spot on our specular weights map. Because we know our specular roughness is going from 0 to 1, so if we want this particular dark spot to be rough, we need to have a specular roughness map that basically makes this part here to be brighter, like here. So now this has a higher specular roughness value, and therefore the surface is going to be rougher here. Perfect. Now, if you take a look at this layer RGBA map, you can see we are using this bitmap, which is our BW38 map, as our first layer RGBA input. Then we're using the BW5, which is this one, as our basically second layer set to multiply, and the mix value is set to about 0.6, so it just adds a bit more darker spots. And if you take a look at this, to actually make this inversion that we talked about, the BW38 hasn't been connected directly to input 1. It's going through a range map. So as you can see, the values here are 0.32 and 0.13. So we're basically inverting the brighter and the dark spot, and basically making them conform to our particular range, which was about 0.2 for our specular roughness as well. And the same thing is happening for our basically our second layer, which was this BW5. It's going through a complement map, which is basically it's basically the invert map. It does the inversion, but it doesn't have much control like the range map, and you can find it in the math nodes. So basically, if I come here, so this is the map directly, okay, and then we make it to go through this complement node, which basically inverts it, and then as our second layer, you can see it just multiplies these darker spots with the mix 2 of about 0.6, so it doesn't affect the shader or the layer RGBA that we have that much. Okay, let me just connect this here. Perfect. And for the third layer, we just have this map, okay, BW22. It's going through this range map, as you can see, just makes the values a bit, the bright values a bit darker, from 0 to 1 to 0 to 0.36. And then, as you can see, again, the mix value is about 0.31, and the operation is set to overwrite. So it just basically blends with the underlying layers here. You can check out these textures on your own. I just want to really be quick and make sure that we cover the more important principles and not just this basic layering up textures, which you are very familiar with most likely. So that's our specular roughness map. Okay, now for the bump map, here we have this, again, this layer RGBA, and this is basically our bump map that we're going to be using. Okay, and what we have done for the bump map, as you can see, we have two inputs. The first input is this BW38 blurred, which is basically the same as the BW38 map that we have used, just a bit blurrier, so we don't have very sharp indents on our surface. And what it does, it's just the first layer. And for the second layer, we are using this BW5 again, this map, just to add a bit extra detail, higher frequency detail to the map. And it's being used as the second input here. If I just turn it off. So as you can see, it's barely adds some details. You can see its opacity or its mix value is about 0.19, so it doesn't add much. Go to 1, just in this case 0.19 would be enough. And now we connect this layer RGBA shader or map to the bump map input of the bump 2D node, and you can find the bump 2D node in the Arnold bump 2D node, and you basically connect this to the bump map, and the particular bump value that we have used here is about 0.03. If the value is higher, those indents will be very, very visible. I think we may have done a bit more. Let's see. Oh, you can see in this map, in this BW38 map, we have used the output section of bitmap node to add a bit more adjustments. You can see if I just connect this map directly, we can see how this works. So this is the map that we have, and if I select this point here and set it to the default value of 0, you can see we get these very dark spots, and I really don't want to have very harsh indents on my surface. So that's why I kind of select this point down here and use something like 1.25.2 just to make those darker values a bit brighter, so we don't get very harsh and sudden basically dents on our surface when this map is used as our bump map, right? So as you can see, the map has been connected to the bump map input of the bump 2D node, and we have the bump height of 0.03, and this will basically be connected to the normal input of the standard surface shader. So that's our standard surface shader. I know we go through it very quick, but as I mentioned, make sure to check out the comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max course at our website mographplus.com, and check out our previous free tutorials on our YouTube channel about shader creation in Arnold for 3ds Max. So this won't look that basically hard for you to follow. If we start to create all of these nodes and create them from scratch, just takes a very long time, which is probably not going to be very popular. So now for the second shader, which is this one, as you can see, we have a very simple shader. I'm just zoom in. So we have this standard surface shader. We have used this texture as the base color input for the standard surface shader. And as you can see, the specular weight is about 0.07, the roughness is about 0.56, so very rough, and the IR is set to about 3. And we also have the bump map for this one, but before this, I'm gonna just make sure, because as you can see, the bump map is coming from the mix map that we have to basically reveal the wood shader. So let me quickly take a look at this map. Okay, perfect. Let me just assign that, just make sure we have the right selection. I'm gonna just connect this layer RGBA to the map to material and assign this here, just show you what we get exactly. So this is the map that basically reveals the wood shader. Now let's see how we have created it. As you can see, we have this layer RGBA shader here, and it has 3 layers. The first layer is basically we have this ambient occlusion, and in the second and third layers, we're just trying to add a bunch of this smaller smudges and spots on the surface to reveal the wood as well here. So let's see how we have created this. If I just make this a bit closer, first of all, we have this first layer, which these are the 4 nodes that make that first layer. First, we have this ambient occlusion map, okay? And you can find the ambient occlusion map in the surface section. This is the ambient occlusion map. And as you can see, the ambient occlusion map here, we have set a sample to 5. The spread is about 1. The white has been set to black. The black is white. And the far clip is set to 0.05. And we're also using the invert normal mode to get this particular look. Now, to break this ambient occlusion map and to break it up, we are using a multiply node this time. We can obviously use a layer RGBA as well, but in this case, we can basically use something like a multiply node. We use this ambient occlusion as our first input, and we then use this bitmap, this one here, which is BW8, as our second input, okay? And this way, if you connect this multiply node to our texture map input of the map to material, you can see we're basically breaking this ambient occlusion up, okay? And now to just add a bit more contrast to the whole thing, we are using the range map again. So this goes to the range map input, and then the range map will basically, what the range map does, if I connect it to the texture map input, you can see just add a bit more detail and how we have done it. Basically, if you select the range map, you can see the input min is 0 to 1, but the output min is from 0 to the output max of 4. So if I just set this to 1 again, we don't have that much of contrast, but if I set it to 4, now we get back the contrast that we were trying to achieve. Okay. Now, For the second layer, we have this, if you take a look at the layer RGBA node, you can see the second layer is using the operation mode of max, and basically it's lightened, so it just tries to, if I connect this to the texture map here, the second layer, so just try to add these spots. And if I take a look at the map itself, that's the map. So as you can see, if I connect this layer RGBA to this texture map, you can see if we can disable these layers. So this is our ambient occlusion only. Then we add our second layer to add a bunch of these spots and smudges, and then our third layer, which is something very similar, just with a bit more intensity and frequency. Okay, and as you can see, the third layer is using the max operation with the mix value of 0.5. Perfect, which is a very similar map to the second layer as well. Now, if I take a look at the main layer shader that we have, as you can see, the first layer for input 1, we're connecting these green paint. For the input 2, we're connecting this wood texture, wood shader here. And for the mix 2, which basically controls where the second layer will show up, here's the mix 2 input of our layer 2. We're using this black and white texture that we just created, right? Okay, perfect. You can obviously delete this map to material if you wanted to, but as you can see, this has been connected to the mix 2. And this way the texture, the wood texture, will only appear on those white and bright spots. Now the wood shader as well has this bump map, as you can see, and the way we have created this bump map here, as you can see, we have used the exact layer RGBA that we had before. This map to material is still connected, but as you can see, it goes through this range map before being connected to this bump map input of the bump 2D node. So what this range map does here, as you can see, it basically inverts the map. And the reason for that, if I just run the active shade, obviously we want these parts where the wood appear to be just a bit more dented compared to the rest of the surface. So we need the inverted version of this. So that's what this range map here is doing. Okay, and now this map, as you can see, this range map has been connected to the bump map input, and bump height that we're using is about 0.03, and this has been connected to the normal input of our standard surface shader, and this will result in our basically final shader here. So here is what we have. As you can see, it's obviously still rendering, and we have progressive rendering enabled. So as you can see, it's nice, it's complex, it just gives that feeling of a kind of painted wood shader. Probably the green paint shader can be a bit more complex, it could be a bit dirtier probably, but you can try that on your own. Now to actually, I'm gonna stop this. To create this kind of other version, which is this kind of black painted wood, we can obviously do that very, very simply. Let me show you that. To do that, we are using this 2 node. First of all, as you can see, we have connected our base color, which is this green color. Let me just have this map to material again. It's very good for visualization purposes. And here we go. So here is our base color layer RGBA node. If I connect this to texture map, obviously we're going to get that green look. Now, instead of connecting it directly to the input, we can obviously make it to go through a color correct node. And for this case, we're using the Arnold color and color correct. And we can make this layer RGBA node to connect to the input, and then connect this color correct to the texture map input here. And now we can make this color correct node. Let's zero out the saturation and just decrease the gamma to something like 0.85. Now we have a black example, and if we connect this obviously to the base color. Here we're going to get that look that we are after. Sorry, the base color here. There we go. If I run the active shade, now as you can see, we're going to get this black painted with example. And this is what we get if we adjust the colors. And we can obviously wait for the active shade to clean this up a bit more. So here it is, as you can see, we get this kind of complex shaders, and it was fairly easy to create, and it really looks nice. You can see we got all of these bump mapping details, all of these texture details, so very, very subtle and beautiful. So that's about this tutorial, folks. And finally, we have this kind of switch shader, and what it does, this switch RGBA, we can connect this base color, this layer RGBA, this green base color as the, I'm gonna just show you what we have here. We have connected this green base color as our input 0, and we have connected this color corrected version as our input 1. And finally, let me just connect this color correct instead of the one that we have. Doesn't really matter that much. And now if I connect this switch RGBA to my base color input here, I can simply switch between the green and the black version by simply changing the index from 0 to 1. There you go. Perfect. I'll just make this a bit smaller. Okay. Great. So that's the final shader network that we have, and this is the final shader that we get. Hopefully you learned something. Maybe the tutorial was a bit too fast for you. As I mentioned, please make sure to check out our comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max course. It's a very long and comprehensive course about every aspect of Arnold inside of 3ds Max, and you get an in-depth look at all of the nodes that we have used here. And check out our free tutorials as well on our YouTube channel to be able to follow this tutorial much better. The link to download the project files for this tutorial can be found down below in the description. Thank you for watching. It was Kamel Khezri from mographplus.com. See you in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching this free video tutorial from mographplus.com. If you are interested in learning Arnold for 3ds Max fundamentally, please make sure to check out our comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max course, which is a massive 8-hour long course in which we explore all the aspects of Arnold for 3ds Max thoroughly.